The first thing Sira Voss noticed about the exiles was that they had books. Not data chips, not holographic memory crystals or neural-threaded storage webs. Books. Physical, paper-paged, spine-cracked, slightly damp-smelling books, stacked in crates strapped to the sides of their battered transport vessel, bundled in waterproof wraps, wedged between the legs of the adults who held children against their chests while the ship descended through cloud cover and shook like a tin can being kicked downstairs. She was 12 years old, and she was the only human on the Welcome Committee. That wasn't supposed to be the case. The Welcome Committee was meant to be Dr. Acaffer from the United Nations Integration Office, 2 translators, a pair of diplomatic aides, and a medical team. But Dr. Acaffer's shuttle had a hydraulic failure outside of Brussels. The translators were stuck in a secondary quarantine loop when their pathogen screening badges malfunctioned. The diplomatic aides were present in spirit only. One had a family emergency. The other had sent a very apologetic automated message. The medical team was present in body, 3 people in hazmat gear standing at the edge of the landing field with equipment cases and expressions Sira couldn't read through their visors. But the medical team was not, technically, the welcome part of the Welcome Committee. So it was just Sira. She stood on the tarmac of what used to be Wellington International Airport, and was now called Earth Integration Terminal 1, holding a handwritten sign that her mother had made at 3 in the morning, because the official printed banner had blown off the roof during last night's storm and nobody had retrieved it yet. The sign said, in English, then Galactic Standard, then the 3 most commonly spoken languages among the confirmed passenger manifest. Welcome, you are safe here. Sira had practiced the Galactic Standard pronunciation with her mother for an hour. Her mother was a linguist and a poet, and entirely too optimistic about things, which was probably why she'd raised a daughter who showed up to alien refugee landings alone with a handmade sign and no backup plan. She was aware, standing there on the tarmac with the sign getting slightly damp from the Wellington morning mist, that this was possibly not a normal thing to be doing at 12. She was also aware that the ship was coming down regardless of whether she was normal or not, and someone should be there. The ship groaned as it settled. It was not a beautiful ship. It was the kind of vessel that had clearly once been beautiful, sleek lines still visible beneath the scoring and the carbon damage, the hull plating that had been replaced so many times in so many colors that it looked like a patchwork quilt scene from orbit. There were scorch marks near the engine housing that weren't from re-entry. The marks had a different geometry than atmospheric burns, sharper-edged, colder-looking, the kind of pattern made by something directed rather than something incidental. Somebody had fired on them. The ramp descended with a hydraulic hiss, and a sound like a very large held breath being released. They came out slowly. There were 43 of them. Sira knew the number from the manifest that had arrived via Tightbeam 3 days ago, but knowing it and seeing it were different things. 43 beings of a species called the Vreth, bipedal, with 4 arms arranged in 2 sets of 2, the upper pair longer and more articulated than the lower. Their skin the deep color of ocean water in the places where it was exposed, and covered elsewhere with layered wrappings that served as both clothing and something closer to armor. Their faces were long and narrow, with eyes placed on the sides of their heads like birds, giving them a visual field that must have made the inside of a transport ship an exercise in claustrophobia. They moved with a careful precision that she recognized, after a moment, as the specific kind of careful that happens when every muscle in your body is exhausted, and you're using the last of your concentration to not show it. They were carrying things. All of them, not luggage in any conventional sense. The crates were being unloaded from the ship separately, already on a ramp of their own, but held things, personal things. Some had small bundles wrapped in cloth. Some had instruments of a kind Sira couldn't identify, shaped like combinations of tools she knew rearranged into configurations she didn't. A few had things that looked like they might be weapons, which Sira noted and then, deliberately did not focus on because they had every right to be carrying weapons, and noting them in a way that made her flinch would not be a good start. The children came out last. There were 11 of them, ranging from very small to not quite adult butt clothes, and they were the ones holding the books. Every child had at least one. Some had 2 or 3 tucked under their upper arms, while their lower arms held the rail on the ramp. The smallest, a Vreth who couldn't have been more than 3 or 4 years old by any equivalent measure, was carrying a book nearly as large as her torso, both sets of arms wrapped around it with the absolute focused determination of someone who would not be separated from this object by any force in the known universe. Sira walked forward. One of the adult Vreth, a tall one, perhaps a head taller than her mother, wearing a sash of some kind across 2 of their 4 shoulders, moved to intercept her. The translator patch on Sira's collar vibrated lightly, and then a voice came through, flat and slightly mechanical but comprehensible. "Stop, this area has not been cleared. Who authorized a child to be on this field?" "Nobody," Sira said honestly. "Dr. Akeffer's shuttle had a hydraulic failure. I'm the welcome committee." The tall Vreth looked at her sign, then at her, then back at the sign. The expression on the long, narrow face shifted in a way that Sira couldn't read yet. She would learn to read Vreth expressions over the following years, slowly and imperfectly, learning the meanings of subtle shifts in the positioning of those side-set eyes, the way the upper set of hands held themselves when someone was tense. But right now the expression was a closed book, and she could only look at what she could read, which was the body, the set of the shoulders, the slight protective lean backward. Someone who had been prepared for complications, and had found a new kind of complication they hadn't specifically prepared for. "You are the welcome committee," the tall Vreth said. "For now, the actual committee will be here in about 4 hours. I live 20 minutes from here. My mom drove me." Sira held the sign a little higher. "You're safe here. I mean it. We cleared the whole grid 12 hours ago, and the Integration Office has filed full hospitality protocols with the Galactic Council. No one can touch you here." "The Galactic Council," the tall Vreth said, and the translator caught something underneath the words, not quite bitterness, not quite grief, something that lived in the narrow space between the two. "We are familiar with the Galactic Council." "I know," Sira said. "I read the whole case file. What they did was wrong." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Behind the tall Vreth, the other adults were watching, and the children were watching, and the mist was still misting, and the hazmat medical team was still standing at the edge of the field trying to look professional and not radiating concern, and Wellington was doing what Wellington does in the mornings, which is be quietly present and gray-green and indifferent to anyone's drama. Then the small Vreth with the large book squeezed between the legs of 2 adults and stood in front of Sira, and looked at her with eyes that were gold and enormous and serious in the way that only the eyes of very young children who have seen very adult things can be serious. "Your sign has a grammatical error," the small Vreth said through the translator. "In Galactic Standard, the verb tense is incorrect. You wrote the past habitual form when you should have written the present absolute. You are safe in present absolute is 3 syllables longer." "I'll fix it," Sira said. "What's your name?" "Tessavith, but everyone calls me Tess." A pause that held the particular texture of a child who has been given a rule and is weighing whether to follow it. "The adults say I should not give my name to strangers." "That's smart advice." Sira crouched down to Tess's eye level. "I'm Sira, and you're not strangers to me. I've been reading about the Vreth for 3 years." Tess looked at her very carefully. "Why?" "Because someone should," Sira said. That was the beginning. The official story of why the Vreth had been exiled from the Galactic Cooperative was 7 paragraphs long and written in the kind of diplomatic language specifically designed to say nothing while appearing to say everything. Sira had read it. Then she'd found the unofficial version, which circulated in academic journals under titles that used words like alleged and disputed, but were otherwise considerably more honest, and she'd read that too. Then she'd found the Vreth Advocacy Network's documentation, which used plain language and was the most complete account she'd found, and she'd read that 3 times. The Vreth were a species of archivists. That was the simplest way to put it. In the way that humans had, at various points in history, defined themselves as tool users or fire makers or storytellers, the Vreth defined themselves as preservers. They kept records, all records, the history of every species they had ever encountered, every war and treaty and famine and artistic movement and technological leap and cultural collapse, preserved in physical form, paper, crystal, carved stone, woven fiber, whatever medium lasted, because the Vreth had a theology of memory. To forget in their cosmology was a kind of death more complete than the death of the body. The body dies once. Memory, if not maintained, dies slowly, silently, and without ceremony, a death no one attends. The Vreth considered this the worst kind. They had been members of the Galactic Cooperative for 600 years. They had been exiled 11 months ago. The official reason was a trade dispute over archive access rights. The Vreth had been cataloging the history of a species called the Marak, a species that the Galactic Council's dominant members had very specific reasons for wanting the history of to remain unclear. The Marak had inhabited a system that was now occupied by 3 cooperative member species. The manner in which that system had come to be occupied was, depending on which version of history you read, either a peaceful economic transition or the systematic erasure of a civilization. The Vreth had refused to find those 2 versions equivalent. The Vreth had, in fact, published a 17-volume preliminary archive of Marak history that drew from sources the cooperative hadn't known. They had a personal testimony recorded in physical books carried by Marak refugees 3 generations back, cross-referenced against astronomical and geological data, cross-referenced again against the official records to identify exactly what had been changed and where the changes were. The work was meticulous. It was the kind of work that is very difficult to argue with on its merits, so people had argued with the right to do it instead. The cooperative had moved to censure, then to sanctions. Then, when the Vreth had published Volume 17 the morning after the sanction announcement, to exile. The Vreth had said, essentially, that they would rather be exiled than stop telling the truth. So they were exiled. 43 of them had made it to Earth. Others were scattered across non-cooperative space, in small communities on stations and marginal worlds, and one group of 12 that had been granted asylum on a planet so remote that it took 8 months to get a message to them. The Vreth who had arrived in Wellington were the Central Archive keepers, the ones who had the core records, who had the children who were being trained in preservation methodology, who had the books. Earth had said yes to receiving them for a set of reasons that were complicated and political, and involved a lot of the UN Integration Office's strategic calculus about Earth's status in galactic diplomacy, but which had at the end of the deliberation come down, in the summary document that Sira's mother had worked on and brought home and left on the kitchen table where Sira had read it, to a sentence that said, "We are a species that has at various times in our history burned our own libraries. We know what that cost, we say yes." Sira had read that sentence at 10 years old and had not fully understood it and had asked her mother, and her mother had sat down and told her about Alexandria, and then about other fires, other losses, the long human habit of destroying what it could not tolerate knowing. And then her mother had said, "But we always regret it. Sooner or later we always regret it. That is something, perhaps, that we have enough of a conscience to know what we've lost." Sira had thought about that for a long time. She'd started writing letters to the Vreth Advocacy Network the following week. She'd been 9, and the letters were earnest and slightly overformal in the way that 9-year-olds are when they are trying to be taken seriously, and one of the network's volunteers had written back with genuine warmth, and included a translated excerpt from a Vreth Children's Archive primer, which had sent Sierra down a research spiral that hadn't really ended. She'd been 12 3/4 when she met them on the tarmac. The Integration Center had originally been a hotel, a large one with a central atrium that had once hosted wedding receptions and conferences on sustainable tourism, and was now partitioned into something more functional, a conference wing repurposed into workshop space, rooms that had once housed tourists now housing families who had crossed most of the known galaxy to be here. The kitchen had been retrofitted to handle 12 different atmospheric requirements and 4 incompatible biochemical dietary needs, which had required significant engineering and a great deal of good faith on the part of the Integration Office's food science team, who had approached the project with the focused intensity of people who understood that getting someone's food wrong is a specific kind of inhospitality that goes deeper than words. It was not beautiful. It had the specific aesthetic of a place that was trying very hard under significant constraints, which meant off-white walls and industrial lighting, and the kind of carpet that had probably once had a pattern but now was simply a color that could be described as previously brown. But the windows were large and the view was of the harbor, and the harbor on a clear day had that particular Wellington light that makes everything look like it's in the opening frame of a story that's about to be told. The Vreth spent their first 3 days not leaving their rooms. This was expected. The Integration Office protocols accounted for it, had a name for it: re-anchoring, the period after high-stress transit when beings who have been in sustained crisis need to establish that a space is actually safe before they can engage with it. The medical team did wellness checks. Meals were delivered. The integration counselors, 3 of whom spoke passable Galactic Standard, and one of whom, Dr. Amara, actually spoke a rudimentary form of Vreth, learned from a language preservation project in South Korea, held brief check-ins at the doors. Sierra was not technically part of the Integration Office. She was a 12-year-old civilian with no official clearance, a loose affiliation with the Welcome Operation because her mother was one of the contract translators, and a specific quality that the professionals were finding valuable, which was that Tess would talk to her. Tess would not talk to the integration counselors. She would not talk to Dr. Amara, despite Dr. Amara's careful and earnest attempts. She would not answer the questions on the standard integration forms, not because she refused, but because she appeared to find the forms themselves puzzling. Why would someone record information in a format that could be changed? Where was the permanence? Who maintained the original? Tess would sit in the doorway of the room she shared with 3 adult Vreth, and hold her enormous book and watch everything with those gold, serious eyes, and say nothing to anyone until Sierra appeared in the corridor. Sierra brought 2 cups of something hot. It couldn't be tea because the Vreth couldn't metabolize terrestrial tannins, but it could be an herbal approximation that the integration kitchen had developed, a blend of things that were warm and slightly sweet, and had enough aromatic complexity to approximate the sensory experience of something comforting. The integration kitchen's food scientist had spent 4 days on it. It was one of the better things about the integration center. She sat down on the floor outside the door and said, "Want to read with me?" And Tess came and sat beside her and they read. It became their routine. Every morning for the first 2 weeks, while the adults moved through the slow, careful work of crisis stabilization, medical assessment, resource distribution, needs documentation, the administrative weight of being a population that has lost its home and is trying to become a presence in an unfamiliar world, Sierra and Tess sat in the corridor and read. Sometimes they read Tess's book, which turned out to be a Vreth archive primer, an introductory text on preservation methodology designed for children, covering subjects like materials durability and transcription accuracy, and the ethics of historical interpretation. The section on the ethics of historical interpretation was 40 pages long and written for children under 10, which said something significant about what the Vreth considered foundational knowledge. Sira couldn't read it herself because it was in written Vreth, which was a pictographic system of considerable complexity developed over centuries to be both visually distinctive and resistant to ambiguity. Every symbol carried a primary meaning and two secondary meanings that only activated in specific grammatical contexts, which made it extremely precise and absolutely impenetrable without years of study. But Tess would point to things and explain them, and Sira would listen. Sometimes they read Sira's books, which she brought in a bag every day, novels mostly, because Tess had never encountered the concept of a story that was not also an archive, and her reaction to fiction was the most complicated thing Sira had ever seen on any face. This did not happen, Tess said, the first time they read through the first 2 chapters of a novel together. No. Then why did someone write it down? Because it feels true, even though it didn't happen. The things people do in it, the way they feel that's real, even if the events aren't. Tess looked at the page for a long time. The words were English, which she couldn't read, so she was looking at the arrangement of them, the shape of the paragraphs, the indented lines that marked dialogue, the white space. We have something similar, she said finally. We call it shadow record. It is not archive. It is a record of what might have been, or what something felt like from the inside. It is not considered legitimate historical evidence. A pause, and her upper hands adjusted their grip on the archive primer she always held in her lap. I have always found it more useful than the adults say it is. Me too, Sira said. On the 4th day, the tall Vreth with the sash, whose name, Sira had learned from her mother, was Arith Vaughn, and who was the senior archivist of the group, roughly equivalent to a head librarian and a judge and a community elder all at once, the kind of position that carries weight not through authority, but through the accumulated trust of everyone who knows what the position requires, asked to speak with someone from the integration office. Dr. Akafer had arrived by then, hydraulic failure resolved and replaced with the efficient forward motion of a woman who had spent 15 years doing this work, and had long since decided that being delayed was simply another data point in an environment full of data points. She was small and precise, and had the expression of someone who had handled difficult situations for so long that difficult situations no longer made her expression change, which was not the same as not caring, but was the operational armor of someone who had to care consistently, and therefore had learned to look like she didn't. She met with Arithvan for 2 hours. Sira's mother translated. Afterward, Dr. Akafer came to find Sira, which was unusual, and which Sira recognized as a signal that something had happened that required navigation. They want to work, she said without preamble. The archive keepers, they've been in transit for 9 months and they're going out of their minds with idleness. They want to know if there are any human archives that need preservation assistance. Sira thought about this. The National Library has a flood-damaged collection from the 2031 storms that no one has had the resources to restore. 19,000 items, some of them significant. They've been in controlled storage, but controlled storage isn't preservation. It's just slowing the decay. Dr. Akafer looked at her. How do you know that? I emailed them 3 years ago asking if I could help, and they said they didn't have a volunteer program, but they'd remember me. Sira paused. I've been waiting for them to have a reason to call. There was a silence in which Dr. Akafer appeared to be revising her model of who she was talking to. You're 12, she said. Almost 13, Sira said, and I've been doing this longer than that. Someone should make the call. Dr. Akafer made the call. The National Library said yes. They said yes with the specific enthusiasm of an institution that has been sitting on a problem for 3 years and has just been offered a solution. And if that solution came in the form of 43 political exiles who communicated through translator patches and had 4 arms and needed the atmospheric controls adjusted slightly, well, The library had its own relationship with the concept of things that needed to be saved and weren't being. The flood-damaged collection turned out to be more significant than the brief description had suggested. 19,000 items was the number of cataloged pieces. The actual scope of the collection was larger, because many items had been grouped under single catalog entries when the original damage occurred, and no one had had the time or resources to break them apart and count properly. There were colonial-era government documents that represented the only surviving copies of certain legislative histories. Personal correspondence from the 1800s that the library's digitization team had been planning to scan for a decade and hadn't gotten to. Maps, surveying records, trade documents, musical scores. And the crown jewel of the damaged collection, which was the botanical journals, 28 volumes, hand-illustrated, kept by a Victorian-era naturalist named Eleanor Marsh, who had spent 30 years documenting the native flora of what was then the New Zealand colony, and whose detailed watercolor illustrations had survived the flooding with varying degrees of damage, from completely pristine to barely legible, with most falling somewhere in the frustrating middle where you could see the image, but couldn't quite read the accompanying notation. The Vreth went through it like a tide. They had techniques for this. Of course they had techniques. They had been preserving physical materials for 6 centuries across dozens of planetary environments with dozens of different material chemistries, and while the specific properties of terrestrial paper were new to them, the underlying principles, how organic materials degrade, how water damage works at the molecular level, how to separate, stabilize, and document without causing further damage, were deeply familiar. They adapted with a speed that left the library staff awed and slightly unsettled, the way you feel when you watch someone do in an afternoon what you'd assumed would take years. Arith Vaughn spent 3 days doing nothing but smelling things, which the library staff initially found unnerving, and then, when he began producing precise chemical analyses of each item's degradation state, stopped finding unnerving and started finding extremely useful. The Vreth had olfactory sensitivity that could detect the specific chemistry of material degradation, acidity levels, fungal presence, protein breakdown in leather and vellum, the particular molecules produced by cellulose decay at different rates, which allowed him to perform a diagnostic assessment of the entire collection faster and more thoroughly than the library's own equipment could manage. By the end of day 3, Arith Vaughn had produced a 47-page preliminary report on the collection's condition, divided by material type, damage category, and urgency of intervention, with a recommended treatment order and a resource estimate. 47 pages, handwritten, Vreth script on one side, Galactic Standard on the other, with Sira's mother doing the English translation in the evenings. Sira sat at a table in the restoration room and watched them work. She was supposed to be doing homework. She had homework. She had a history paper due on Thursday and an algebra set that she'd been putting off and a book report that she'd finished 3 weeks ago because the book had been good. But the homework stayed in her bag and she watched. The thing she noticed was the coordination. 4-handed work has a different quality than 2-handed work, and watching the Vreth work in pairs, 2 archivists to a damaged document, upper hands doing one kind of work while lower hands did another, was watching a kind of precision that had developed over centuries to the point where it looked effortless, which was exactly what genuine mastery looks like, she thought, not the performance of ease but the actual thing. Arith Vaughn, working alone on the Eleanor Marsh journals, had a different quality. He worked slowly and with an attention that felt almost ceremonial. Each journal opened with care, the damaged pages touched at the edges only, the assessment made with all 4 hands held near without touching, while he did whatever diagnostic work the smell of it was telling him. He had been doing this for, probably, most of his life. He had been doing this while 9 months of transit and the weight of exile and the specific grief of a people who have lost their community in the galaxy pressed down on him. And he was doing it here anyway, on the other side of the galaxy, for records that weren't his people's. Tess appeared beside Sierra and sat down. "You are doing the face," Tess said. "What face?" "The face you make when you are thinking something that you haven't found words for yet." Tess opened her archive primer in her lap, a habitual gesture that seemed to happen without conscious choice. "My father makes that face when he is about to say something important." Sierra looked at Tess. "Is Arithvan your father?" "Yes." Sierra hadn't known that. She'd assumed Arithvan was the senior archivist, an official, someone in a position of authority who happened to be present. The idea that the tall, serious being who had stood between the refugees and the world, and demanded to know who authorized a child to be on the field, was also someone's father. That behind the professional precision was a specific relationship to a specific small person who called him father, rearranged something in Sierra's understanding. "He doesn't seem like a dad," she said, before she could stop herself. "He is a very good archivist," Tess said carefully, with the precision of someone who has thought about this before. "He is still learning to be a father. He does the two things in the wrong order sometimes. He documents before he feels." A pause. "He says that is a professional hazard." "I think it is a protective one." Sierra thought about her own mother, who felt before she documented and sometimes got into trouble for it and sometimes changed things because of it, who had come home 7 years ago with a strange expression on her face because she had found something that moved her and had decided immediately to share it with her daughter. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I think I get that." They watched Arithvan work until the library closed, and then Sierra's mother came to collect her. And on the drive home, Sierra's mother asked what she was thinking about, and Sierra said she was thinking about how the thing you choose to preserve tells you what you think matters, and her mother was quiet for a while and then said, "Yes. That's the whole argument, isn't it?" 3 weeks after the Vreth arrived, the Galactic Council sent an observer. His name, the galactic standard name he gave, which was almost certainly a title rather than a personal name, was Delegate Liaison 2nd Class Oren Tall. He was of a species called the Semari, tall and bilaterally symmetrical, with a faint iridescence to the skin that Sierra kept noticing and trying not to obviously notice, who were the third most powerful species in the cooperative, and who had a long institutional history of being the cooperative's preferred messengers when the cooperative wanted to send a message without technically sending a message. He arrived with 2 aides and a lot of very precisely worded diplomatic language, and he met with Dr. Akafer, and he met with the Wellington City Government Liaison, and he met with 3 representatives of the UN Integration Office. He did not officially meet with any of the Vreth. He was not, officially, there about the Vreth. He was there on what his credentials described as a general cultural exchange visit to assess Earth's integration facilities. He walked through the National Library's restoration room on what was officially part of his cultural exchange itinerary, and officially expressed polite interest in Earth's archival traditions. Sierra was at her table in the corner when he came through. She'd started being at her table in the corner every day after school, ostensibly to help, but actually because she had discovered that the restoration room was a place where she could think without distraction. Something about the quality of the silence in there, the focused attention of the Vreth working around her, made it easier to think clearly. She watched the delegate liaison watch Arithvan work. Arithvan was doing the extremely delicate work of separating 2 pages of the botanist's journals that had dried fused together over the 3 years since the flood. He had a tool approximately the width of a human hair, and he was working with the absolute still focus of someone for whom interruption is not a concept that applies to this particular moment. The delegate liaison stood and watched for a long time. The aide stood behind him and watched him watch. Tess was across the room, on a stool at the high catalog table working. She did not look up. "The archive is here," the delegate liaison said, not loudly in galactic standard. He seemed to be speaking to no one in particular, or perhaps to himself, in the way people do when something has confirmed what they came to confirm. They brought it. Most of it, Sira said. The delegate liaison looked at her. He had eyes that were placed forward like a human's, and they held a range of expression that she could read more easily than Vreth expression, which made it easier and harder simultaneously. Easier to understand what he was thinking, harder to pretend she couldn't. She watched surprise, and then something calculating, and then something that might, if you were generous, have been a form of guilt. "You understand Galactic Standard," he said. "Enough, my mom's a linguist." Sira kept her voice even. "She works for the Integration Office." "You are very young to be involved in political matters." "I'm not involved in political matters," Sira said. "I'm involved in library matters. This is a library. Those are archivists doing archival work." She looked at him steadily. "The political part is that someone tried to stop them from doing it." The silence stretched. "The Marak historical record," the delegate liaison said quietly. "It creates difficulties." "I know. I read the preliminary volumes. My mom translated parts of them." She paused, and the thing she'd been thinking about since she first read those volumes, since she was 10 years old, reading about the Marak in her mother's careful translation, reading what had happened to them and what had been done to the record of what happened, gathered itself into something speakable. The Marak were a real people. They had a history. What happened to them happened. Pretending the record of it is a problem doesn't make them less real. It just makes the historical record less true. "Truth," the delegate liaison said, and the word came out weighted, not lightly, not dismissively, with the weight of someone who had spent time with this word and found it difficult. "Is often less simple than young people suppose." "My mom says that too," Sira said. And then she says, "But simple or not, you still have to tell it. Because the alternative, the choice not to, is a choice you have to keep making forever. Every day you maintain the silence, you have to choose it again. That's not simplicity either. That's just a different kind of hard." She watched him leave. She was shaking slightly, she noticed. The shaking wasn't visible, but she could feel it in her hands. She had not planned to say any of that. It had gathered and come out, and now it was in the air of the library and she couldn't take it back, which was its own kind of record. Tess appeared at her elbow. "That was accurate," Tess said. "Your Galactic Standard pronunciation has also improved. You are no longer making the past habitual error in the verb form." "I practiced," Sira said, and her voice came out only slightly unsteady. The delegate liaison left Wellington 3 days later. He did not make any official statements. He did, apparently, send a series of tight beam communications back to cooperative space, because the Vreth Advocacy Network reported a sudden significant increase in encrypted traffic out of the Wellington relay station. The increase was not subtle. The people who monitored these things described it, in the Advocacy Network's bulletin, as unusual. 2 weeks after the delegate liaison's departure, the Integration Office received an unofficial communication through back channels. Then another, then a third. Dr. Akefer called a meeting. The meeting was in the Integration Center's conference room, which smelled of the air purification system the cooperative had supplied as a goodwill gesture, and which held about 30 people, Integration Office staff, some Vreth representatives including Arith Vaughn, Sira's mother as a translator, and Sira, who was there because Tess wouldn't come without her, and Tess had been specifically requested by her father, which was a first. "The communications are from 3 separate member species," Dr. Akefer said. She was using a flat, neutral tone that Sira had learned meant she was managing her own reaction very carefully, the way a person who is trying not to let hope show through speaks when they can't quite contain it. "All 3 have archives they describe as being in need of preservation assistance. All 3 are specifically requesting that the Vreth archivists conduct the work." A pause. "None of them are officially acknowledging that the Vreth are in exile." Arith Vaughn was quiet for a moment. He sat in the way he sat when he was processing something, very still, upper hands folded on the table, lower hands in his lap. They are acknowledging us without acknowledging us. That appears to be the diplomatic structure, yes. If they use our services, Arithvan said slowly, and accept our archival work as legitimate, the work carries our institutional signature, our methodology, our source citations, our provenance documentation. Every piece of work we produce carries our name on it. It would, Sierra's mother said, looking up from her notes. Which creates a precedent, Dr. Akafor said. Which creates a record, Arithvan said. There was something in his voice now, the narrow space between hope and caution that Sierra had been learning to hear. A record that the Vreth are working archivists, recognized by cooperative member species. It is not the same as having our exile rescinded, but it is. Adore, Tess said. Everyone looked at her. Tess was holding her archive primer. She looked at her father, and Sierra watched Arithvan look back at his daughter with the expression she had started learning to read. The one that appeared when he was caught between his instinct to document first and his instinct to feel, and the feeling was winning. It is a door, Arithvan agreed. The first remote archive project began 6 weeks after that. One of the requesting species had a collection of historical materials from a pre-spaceflight era that had never been properly catalogued, planetary unification records, primarily from a period that was politically sensitive because the unification had not been entirely voluntary, and the current government preferred the official history to remain somewhat vague about the specifics. The Vreth accepted the project. They did not make the political sensitivity their business. They catalogued what was there. Their catalog noted, in the methodological footnotes that every Vreth archive document included, that certain materials appeared to have been removed from the collection prior to its transfer to the Vreth team. This was noted without editorial comment. It was simply part of the record. Then 2 more projects. Then 5. The Vreth who were not physically traveling to partner species archive sites were working remotely, coordinating via Tightbeam, building the kind of detailed, cross-referenced multi-species historical record that the Galactic Cooperative had been claiming was impossible, and that the Vreth were doing anyway, efficiently and relentlessly, from a repurposed hotel in Wellington. Tess spent most of her days in the National Library. She had moved from helping with the flood-damaged collection to something she'd invented herself. A cross-species index of the library's holdings that noted which items contained information relevant to species outside of humanity. The reasoning was simple, or at least Tess explained it simply. Human archives almost certainly contained information about species the humans hadn't recognized as significant at the time of documentation, species encountered during early space contact periods, species mentioned in alien records that cross-referenced human events, species whose history intersected with human history in ways that neither party had formally acknowledged. Someone should find those intersections. Someone should build a map. She proposed the project to the head librarian with a formal presentation that included a materials estimate, a project timeline, and a proposed cataloging protocol. The head librarian was a quiet man named Mr. Furs, who had devoted his life to the precise organization of things that other people had created, and who had the demeanor of someone who has dealt with large collections of words for so long that he has become somewhat word-like himself, dense with meaning in small space, most fully understood only with careful attention. He and Tess had reached a mutual understanding within about 4 days. They communicated primarily in the language of catalog entries and reference requests, which turned out to translate well across species. He gave her a corner desk and access to the cataloging system, and treated her project as he treated all legitimate projects, with the assumption that if the work was done carefully, it was worth doing. Sierra was doing homework at the corner desk. Her homework had migrated there when she realized the restoration room was good for thinking, and the catalog corner was good for working. when Tess came to sit with her and showed her the index entry she had just written. It was for a collection of letters written by a First World War soldier to his family. Standard enough collection. But the index entry Tess had written noted, in the subject metadata, contains detailed accounts of maintaining communication under censorship conditions during extended separation, strategies developed for encoded emotional transmission within constrained formats, documentation of relationship preservation across physical and psychological distance. And then, in the notes field, potentially relevant to Vreth diaspora documentation as parallel cultural pattern, the maintenance of connection across imposed separation. That's beautiful, Sira said. It is accurate, Tess said, but the way she said it acknowledged that these were not different things. Sira looked at the entry for a long time, then she said, Tess, do you know what happened to the Marak? What actually happened to them? Yes, Tess said. My father has been compiling the record since before I was born. I have read all 17 volumes. A pause. They were people who kept records in a different form than we do, oral tradition primarily. Stories passed through generations. When the occupation occurred, the stories continued. They were harder to suppress than physical documents. The cooperative's member species who took the system tried, but oral tradition does not have a single location. It cannot be burned. Another pause. My father says that is the most important thing the Marak archive taught us. No single format is sufficient. You need all of them. Sira thought about this. She thought about Elinor Marsh's botanical journals, the watercolor illustrations preserved because someone had used paper and pigment rather than any digital format. She thought about the First World War soldiers' letters, physical paper carried across a century because it had survived in a box in someone's attic. She thought about Tess's archive primer, carried from the other side of the galaxy under both sets of arms. All of them, she repeated. All of them, Tess said. Sira was 16 when Arith Vaughn received the official communication. She was in the restoration room when it happened. She had her own corner there now, her own set of tools. She was doing a fellowship year before university, working on the final volumes of the Elinor Marsh restoration project that had taken 4 years of careful incremental work. She had learned over those 4 years more about paper chemistry and water damage and the specific pigments of Victorian watercolors than she had learned about most things taught in school. She had also learned a fair amount of Vreth, which she could now read at a slow but functional pace, and could speak well enough to have basic conversations without the translator patch. This was apparently unusual enough that it had been mentioned in 2 academic articles about the Earth-Vreth integration. Arith Vaughn came into the restoration room holding a data crystal and stood very still in the center of the room, which was how she knew something significant had happened. She had learned over 4 years that Arith Vaughn stood very still when he was processing something emotionally significant. He stood very still the way his people documented things, completely, without movement, making space for the thing to be fully received before he did anything with it. Tess was across the room. She was 18 now, taller than Sira, her archive primer still under her arm with the same unconscious habitual certainty. She looked up from the cross-species index, which now had 11,000 entries and was being used by researchers at universities on 4 planets, and had been cited in 8 peer-reviewed papers, and had caused Mr. Furs to describe it, in the closest thing to enthusiasm she had ever heard from him, as genuinely remarkable work, and saw her father standing still. She got up and went to him. He showed her the data crystal. Sira couldn't read the expression on either of their faces from across the room, but she watched Tess reach up with 2 of her 4 hands and take her father's lower set hands in hers, and she watched Arith Vaughn close all 4 of his hands around his daughter's, and she understood enough. Dr. Akeffer came in 10 minutes later. The cooperative has offered a conditional reinstatement, she said. She looked like someone who has been keeping a careful watch on something for a very long time, and is trying not to look at it directly in case it disappears. Conditional on the VRETH agreeing to certain archive access protocols that are worded very carefully, so that the cooperative doesn't have to officially admit that those protocols were the problem in the first place. That is very diplomatic, Arithvan said. It is genuinely infuriating, Dr. Akafer said, and for a moment her careful professional neutral face slipped into something more honest and more human. But it is also a reinstatement. Arithvan looked at the crystal. The Marek volumes. The protocols don't specifically address them. Dr. Akafer's voice was very precise. They address access rights going forward. What has already been published is not addressed. A silence. In archival terms, Sira's mother said carefully, from where she was sitting at the translation table where she had been sitting in one form or another for 4 years. Something that is published and in circulation is part of the historical record. It cannot be unpublished. It is, as a matter of archival principle, simply there. Arithvan looked at her for a long moment. No, he said, and the word carried the specific weight of acknowledgement, the recognition of something that has been done and cannot be undone, which is both a loss and a completion, and which the VRETH of all peoples understood. It cannot. The night before the formal acceptance ceremony, Arithvan asked to speak with Sira privately. She met him in the corridor outside the restoration room. The library was closed, the lights low in the way institutional lighting goes low when the institution is at rest, and Arithvan stood in the particular quality of that low light and looked at her, and was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was going to say something he had been thinking about for a while. When we landed, he said, I asked who authorized a child to be on the field. I know. I was frightened. I have not said this to you before. He looked at her with those side-set eyes that she could now, after 4 years, read more accurately than she'd imagined possible when she first stood on the tarmac. I was frightened and I did not wish to show it, and when I am frightened I reach for protocol. I ask for the structure. Who authorized this? What is the procedure? It is how I have managed fear for a long time. Okay, Sira said. You said no one had authorized you, that your committee was absent. You gave us the sign your mother had made at 3 in the morning and told us we were safe. You were. We could not have known that. You could not guarantee it. I know, Sira said, but I meant it, and I thought, she stopped, started again. I thought that if the first thing you saw when you landed was someone who meant what they said, that was worth something, even if it was just one person, even if it was just a kid. She paused. Especially if it was just a kid, maybe, because there was nothing strategic about it. It was just true. Arithvan was quiet for a long moment. The low library light came through the window from the street outside, and Wellington was doing its nighttime thing, the harbor faintly audible if you were quiet enough to hear it. In archival methodology, he said, we make a distinction between the evidentiary record and the foundational record. The evidentiary record is what can be verified, cited, cross-referenced. It is the body of the archive. The foundational record is the first thing, the thing that everything else is built on. It is often the smallest piece, a single letter, a single witness account, a marginal notation, a name written on a document that might otherwise have no provenance. He paused. The foundational record cannot be reconstructed if it is lost. The evidentiary record can be rebuilt from secondary sources, partially, imperfectly, but the foundational record is either there or it isn't. He looked at her. You are in our foundational record, he said. The record of this period will note many significant events, diplomatic communications and legal proceedings and institutional decisions. The restoration of the Aliner Marsh collection, the cross-species index, the Marak preliminary volumes and their continued presence in circulation, but the foundational record, the record of the first thing that was true when we arrived, is a 12-year-old human standing on a tarmac with a handmade sign with a grammatical error in the galactic standard. Sierra's throat did something complicated. I had a grammatical error, she managed. Tess corrected it, Arithvan said, and something in his voice appeared that she had never heard from him before, something warm, something that was almost carefully humor. She notes that you have not made that error since. I practiced, Sierra said. She walked home that night through the Wellington streets, through the particular nighttime version of the harbor light, and she thought about foundational records and what it meant to be the first true thing. And she thought about Eleanor Marsh walking through the New Zealand bush with her journals and her watercolors, documenting things for the love of the documentation. And she thought about the soldier writing letters home that said more than the censors allowed and less than what he felt, and exactly what was true. And she thought about Tess's cross-species index, growing every day, 11,000 entries and counting, a map of all the places where different kinds of knowing had touched without knowing it. She thought truth is stubborn. You put it somewhere real and it stays. The ceremony was at 9 in the morning Wellington time. There were 30 people in the conference room and several hundred watching via integration feed from the rest of the building. And by the time the feed was syndicated, approximately 12 million watching from Earth, which was not an insignificant fraction of the population that had been paying attention to this, and an estimated 2 billion from various points across the cooperative. The cooperative's public, it turned out, had been paying more attention than the cooperative's officials had perhaps intended. Tess stood next to Sierra. She had her archive primer under one arm. 4 years and it was the same book, worn now, the spine completely softened, the pages faintly wavy with the number of times they had been turned. Some pages had notes in them, small, dense Vreth pictographics in the margins, things Tess had added as her understanding had grown. Sierra had once asked if it bothered her to write in the margins of the book. Tess had looked at her with genuine puzzlement and said, "Where else would I put it? The book is where I keep what I know." "Are you nervous?" Sierra asked. "I am recording," Tess said. "The internal recording. My father calls it attentiveness. I call it the thing you do when you know that the moment you are in is going to matter." She looked at the screen where Cooperative Council representatives were assembling in chambers somewhere far away. "I have been doing it since the tarmac, on the day we landed. I recorded everything. Even me with the wrong sign. Especially you with the wrong sign." And there it was, Tess's equivalent of a smile, the way the eyes shifted and the upper hands relaxed, something that Sierra had learned to read and which she found, now that she could read it, one of her favorite things in the world. The error is part of the record. It is accurate. Dr. Akefer called the room to attention. The Cooperative Council representative read the reinstatement declaration in Galactic Standard. The formal language of it both hollow and significant in the way that formal language is. Hollow because the words don't contain the reality. Significant because the words change the reality regardless. Arithvan read the Vreth acceptance in both Galactic Standard and written Vreth, the latter spoken aloud for the first time publicly at this kind of event. Sierra had heard Vreth spoken aloud before. Tess spoke it when she was reading to herself. Sometimes, a quiet murmur, but not like this, not ceremonially. The sounds of it filled the conference room with something she felt in her chest before she understood it with her mind. Ancient and careful and precise, a language built for the weight of preserving things, shaped by 6 centuries of knowing what it costs to lose something. When it was done, there was applause from the integration office staff. Because they were human and humans applaud when something ends well, and they are not entirely sure what else to do with the feeling of it. The Vreth watched the applause with an expression Sierra could now read as interested and slightly puzzled. The Vreth equivalent of acknowledgement was silence, was the specific quality of witnessed and recorded attention, and the human impulse to make noise seemed to them both unnecessary and, in its own way, endearing. In the quiet after the applause, Tess reached over and took Sierra's hand. Not 2 sets of hands. One. One hand, 4-fingered, warm, wrapped around Sierra's with deliberate care, The grip of someone who has learned over 4 years exactly which human gestures mean what, and has chosen this one on purpose, because it is the right record of this moment. Sira held on. Later, months later, years later, in the long time after the ceremony during which the world continued doing what worlds do, Tess would show Sira the entry she had made in her personal record on the day of the reinstatement. It was written in Vreth pictographics, which Sira could now read at a slow, functional pace, but Tess translated it aloud anyway, in the way she did when she wanted something to be heard, not just understood. Day 407 since landing. Reinstatement accepted. There is a word in Galactic Standard Refu that does not translate directly into Vreth because we had not, as a people, had the experience it describes in this specific form. We have now. The word means something like, the place where your truth is safe enough to keep telling it. We came to Earth exiled by those who found our truth inconvenient. We did not lose the archive. We did not stop the work. The Marek record stands. The 17 volumes are in circulation and cannot be recalled. The cross-species index exists and grows. The foundational record stands. A human girl with a handmade sign stood on a tarmac and meant what she said. We are still here. The archive is still here. We are writing this down. Sira sat with that for a long time in the corner of the restoration room. The last of Alina Marsh's botanical journals finished now. The illustrations fully legible. The notation in Marsh's precise Victorian hand entirely readable. 30 years of careful observation preserved and findable. She said, Tess, you know what I think about the shadow record. The one that isn't considered legitimate historical evidence. What do you think? I think what something felt like from the inside is exactly as true as anything else. Maybe truer, because evidence can be altered. But what a thing felt like that lives in every person who was there. It can't be edited. It can only be told or not told. Tess opened her archive primer. She turned to the first page, which had been turned to more times than any other page, the paper worn smooth at the corner from 4 years of her thumb. She pointed to a line near the top of the page. Sira had seen her point to this line before, had wondered what it said. The first lesson, Tess said, page 1. It has been the first lesson for as long as the primer has existed. She traced the pictographics slowly, the way she did when she was being exact. It says, the truest record is the one that is told. The record that lives only in one mind dies with that mind. Tell it. Tell it to anyone who will listen. Tell it to children, especially children who will carry it forward. The work of preservation is not the keeping of things. It is the telling of them. Outside the window of the National Library, Wellington was going about its afternoon. Trams and pedestrians and the particular gray-green light off the harbor, the city that had said yes when it could have said no, the tarmac where a girl with a sign had stood and meant what she said, and set a thing in motion that could not be unmade because it was in the record. The foundational record, the first true thing, the thing that everything else was built on. The books were still there, all of them, everyone. Truth turned out to be what it always is. Stubborn, inconvenient, and impossible to unpublish once enough hands have held it. That was the whole story. And it was in the archive.